This is Yard Dog, one of mine. People thought that his affinity with dogs might be Arthur Nash's saving grace. He had a real way with them, almost as though they understood what he was saying. Since he was in primary school, he walked dogs and trained them for pocket money, and he could rapidly get the most intransient animal to stop pulling and sit down when it was told. Well, when he told it. Sometimes owners were another matter. His favourites were capable of far more and wouldn't have disgraced a police display team or one man and his dog, though sometimes their owners were unaware of this. Of course, it wasn't his saving grace. There was no saving an Arthur Nash. Arthur was the youngest of 3 generations, all called Arthur Nash, all living in his house. His father and grandfather nominally ran an upholstery business. They had a cheap source of feathers and were handy with a staple gun and a sewing machine. It was a useful little earner, a good way to get a look over private houses, and a good reason to have the van and the premises. Often when they made deliveries, his father and grandfather took Arthur with them, especially when there was a dog. They were hot on charm, and middle-class households were easily charmed by 3 generations of good old London cockneys who shared the same name and expressed the same old-fashioned values of working-class people contented with their lot. It made them feel justified. How did we get on in the house? Well, he's young Arthur, I'm Arthur, and Dad's old Arthur. Don't know what we'll do if young Arthur settles down and has kids before Dad goes, though. Bound to call the first one Arthur. I'm not that old, I ain't going yet. Anyway, it's easy. He'll be baby Arthur, won't he? Like you was till Dad went. They were even more delighted when they learned that the boy, who'd made friends with the family pet, did the onerous dog walking for pocket money. They loved their pet, but walking every day became wearing. After a while, the 3 Arthurs would return one night, and young Arthur would walk the dog while Arthur and old Arthur made the collection that would surprise the owners when they came down in the morning. They've left my china and taken the telly. I wonder why the dog didn't bark. No, the only graces that young Arthur had were the aforementioned Nash charm and the fact that he was English, unlike his biggest rival in the Bad Boy Stakes, Dermot O'Brien. Dermot and Arthur had shared a classroom since first starting school, and Arthur had frequently used the teacher's prejudice and that Nash charm to blame the unruly red-headed son of an Irish tinker family for his own misdemeanours. Not that Dermot was blameless, that was why it worked, but Dermot had a huge score to settle one day. Meanwhile, young Arthur was growing up. Earning pocket money walking dogs was becoming unbelievable. He needed a new scam. Over the years he'd noticed that being with a dog gave one a reason to exist. More than once a police car had slowed down, then speeded up again when it saw the dog he was walking. It was a natural progression to take a dog with him when he went out. Any dog. It was when he had the idea that he chose a permanent dog and started training it seriously. It was a Doberman. Its birth family lived some way off, so he was unlikely to be recognised, and his other main advantage was that he'd been left a little long without human attention when he was a pup, and he had that streak of pure wolf. It was under control with Arthur. Channelled, he became the yard dog. The yard was his, and once warned, intruders were fair game. If you wanted to enter the Nash yard behind the shop, he'd confront you and bark once. For most people, once was enough with a bark like his, even if they didn't read the notice. If you were stupid enough to take no notice, there were no further warnings, he'd have you. It was young Arthur's little conceit that he'd trained him to the command, maim. Kill's over the top. Maim you're going to have to live with, he'd say. To most appearances, a normal yard dog, but not. Firstly, the staple holding the chain to his post had been worked in and out several times. If called, he'd come at full tilt and it'd pop out so easily he'd barely notice. In case that didn't work or the chain got caught up on something, young Arthur had also weakened one of the links near the collar. It was the training, not the chain, that kept him in the yard. Even more impressive, though, was the way that young Arthur had taught him to respect human boundaries. He would guard any yard Arthur put him in. It didn't need dog-proof fences. In fact, it didn't even need fences. When they went down the caravan, they'd show him the perimeter around it and go out for the day. Didn't need to lock the door. There was another trait that he'd acquired without training, though possibly he'd learnt it through association with the Nash family. He hated uniforms in general, and policemen in particular. In his own yard, he stuck to young Arthur's rules. If they were visiting a house at night, he knew he had leeway. A passing policeman, unsatisfied by the warning bark, would be far too occupied to stop young Arthur leaving. Be a shame to lose good dog, but that's what he's there for at the end of the day, ain't it? Go down doing his job, young Arthur would say. Anyway, chances are he'll win and bring himself home. The older Nashes had acquired their moral code from the British upper classes who led them through 2 world wars, and they'd passed it on to young Arthur. Young Arthur had all but forgotten about Dermot O'Brien since leaving school and starting his nighttime adventures. One should never underestimate one's enemies. Dermot was the one with the grudge, and his scholarly failure was through a lack of interest in the irrelevant rather than a deficit in memory. He'd forgotten nothing and had been keeping an eye on Arthur. He'd seen how Arthur and the dog operated. Excuse me a second. Lights flashing. He'd seen how Arthur and the dog operated. He'd even approached a house one night when he saw reflected torchlight. The dog barked, and the torch remains frozen for nearly 10 minutes before Arthur came out and collected the dog. He hadn't been foolish enough to put out the light and draw attention to it. Dermot's Uncle Michael ran a scrapyard and had been doing some dodgy deals lately. He'd squared off his local copper, but a good yard dog was exactly what he needed to keep other prying eyes out of his business. Nearly 10 minutes before Arthur came out would be more than enough time for what Dermot planned. Dermot's after-school career had been in powders and pills, and he had one particular customer, a trophy wife, who was into downers rather than the whiz and ease of the younger generation or the cocaine of the nouveau riche. After some experimenting with various combinations of Valium, Tramadol, codeine, Nembutal, etc. on small pieces of steak, he worked out a dosage, at the expense of a few canine headaches in a few local backyards. He followed Arthur one night, waited until he was in the house, then lobbed the bait over the fence from a distance. He waited a short while longer, then approached close enough to elicit the single bark before the dog collapsed. He had plenty of time to leave with the dog before Arthur would appear. Dermot had no idea how lucky he was to miss meeting the police. An elderly neighbour, attending a call of nature in the middle of the night, had seen the dog in the yard, where he knew there shouldn't be one, and called them, thinking it a large and dangerous stray. The dog handler investigating met Arthur on the back doorstep. Dermot's share of nemesis came later. The dog had settled in well at Uncle Michael's. Dermot had even paid a visit to the Nash yard for his chain and kennel. With no young Arthur or dog about, that had been easy. It was when the local plod arrived to be paid off all hell broke loose. If there'd been an Arthur Nash present, training would have told. The dog would have left him. But the loosened staple gave him his chance, and he wasn't giving up a policeman for an O'Brien. The dog lunged, the copper ran, the staple popped as he turned, thinking he was beyond reach, and the full weight of a Doberman, who had not been shown the boundary, hit him in the chest. Michael's two eldest boys ran to the rescue as he fell back and raised his arms to protect his face. One of them grabbed the end of the chain and yanked it as hard as he could, shouting at the top of his voice. The chain snapped, dumping him on his arse, and the dog turned towards this new adversary. As one brother aimed a kick, the other on the floor swung the broken chain. The dog dodged nimbly out of the way, and the chain caught the brother standing on one leg, jerking him off balance. For a moment, the dog and the brother holding the end of the broken chain surveyed each other across the wreckage of bodies. Then, as the humans started to pull themselves to their feet, the dog turned and loped off down the street. 3 and a chain to 1 was not good odds, and there'd be other policemen other days. But the set of his ears showed he'd enjoyed himself. So it came about that everyone got their comeuppance. For Arthur, it was 6 months for burglary. The relationship between Uncle Michael and the policeman was discovered in the subsequent investigation. As well as the policeman receiving some nasty bites, they both got done for corruption. Michael's two eldest took it upon themselves to make sure that Dermot fully understood the folly of what he'd done. The only one to walk scot-free was the dog, who escaped in the confusion and turned up a week later at his birth family's house, thin and dirty and trailing a very short length of chain. I often wonder why he'd come to dislike uniforms so much. Thank you. If you like it, don't forget to subscribe and then you'll hear the new ones. Alright. Thank you. Bye.